All right, we are live on YouTube. It is March 31st, 2022 at 7:02 p.m. We'll call to order this special meeting of the Reading Board of Education. Present in person are myself, Chris Bartlett, and Sharad Sadana. Present via Zoom are Laura Gibbons and Stephanie Colton, as well as members of the administration and members of the public who are joining us in person. The first item on the agenda is public comments. Any members of the public wish to be heard, please raise your hand. Kristen, go ahead.
Back to stand.
No. Whatever makes you.
I can say. Okay, so Kristen Anstead, Whirlberry Road. I just wanted to make a quick comment. I was at the Board of Finance meeting that was a couple of days ago, and some of the comments that were made by members were a little bit disturbing to me. Statements like, we've been cheating the general education programs and it comes at the expense, we've been cheating the general education programs and it comes at the expense of the general education students, who are 80% of the population. And the general education programs have been competing with special education, even though nobody really wants to admit it. We are competing against ourselves when we impose these very weighty burden, the very weighty burden of special education. I was pretty upset by the comments. Frankly, they seem a bit discriminatory to me towards a protected class, as we know. And I think that when those types of words are used, people need to think about what happens when we don't support those students. And when we don't support those students, all sorts of social, emotional, and whatnot. When the question was asked what our current numbers are for special education, and then a board member, Dr. McKinnon, mentioned what they were, and then a board member said that we were heading in the right direction. My question is are we really heading in the right direction? Because if you get on the EdSite webpage that will give you all of the numbers for Connecticut, we had a drop from 18.5% down to 15.4% from the 2019 to 2020 to the very next school year, which means roughly 31 students. And my question is how does that happen? How do 31 special education students all of a sudden not need services? And I fear that there is this silent push with the Board of Finance to lower costs. And one of the quickest way to lower costs is to deny student services. For people that don't know how it works, it's a two-pronged approach. First, you have to have an identifiable disability, but then it's the level of impact. And where districts can play a little bit of the game is the identifiable impact. I have two children in this district. I'm going to speak about one of them quickly. I have a daughter in the 3rd grade who has been diagnosed with dyslexia and dysgraphia and ADHD. I have spent thousands of dollars on outside assessments. I've spent thousands of dollars in all sorts of services, reports, whatnot, and an advocate. I've been to multiple PPT meetings in 504. Currently, my daughter is being denied for everything, for her dyslexia and her dysgraphia. No supports, no services, no accommodations. My child is in her 8th year of direct instruction, 3 years of primary in a Montessori school and now 5 years in the Reading district. And her general education classroom teacher just last week in a meeting said, sometimes she forgets how to write a lowercase p. 8 years of instruction, but yet that's not an impact. So I worry that the Board of Education, I feel, is here to protect the students within our town. They're here to educate and they're here to support. And if the Board of Education isn't willing to spend the time to maybe educate people or support or stand up for that population, it turns into this, well, kids are taken away from the general education population. It's the biggest part of our budget. And those types of things happen. And it's very frustrating as a parent to know that we are being asked as a board to drop $100,000 off of a budget when we are coming out of a pandemic. The social emotional impact for the children who have no issues is large. We know that the need is there for extra support and extra help, but yet a pickleball court seems like the right thing to do at the tune of almost $600,000. And as a parent with a child who has an identified learning disability, and my child is being denied services, While the Board of Finance is pushing back on some ridiculous small number, I just feel like the Board of Education really needs to say no and say, listen, all of the surrounding towns are upping their budgets. They're upping them significantly, 5%, 6%, 4%. And I mean, once again, I've been, Chris, 5 years, 6 years, you've seen me at these meetings, and every year it's a cut. What can we do? No Chromebooks this year, no this, no that. And it's very frustrating as a parent, especially a parent who currently has a child who has a need, and currently the district is denying that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Additional public comment? None. Move on to board member comments. Go ahead.
So I watched the Board of Finance meeting after it happened. I wasn't able to attend. But I like to look at my role here, at least as someone who's here to essentially help make sure that we're doing the best we can. I have a very business, my background is in business, so I look at everything kind of in that way. It's about efficiency and efficacy. And when we're making these decisions on resources, where we're looking at, hey, where can we cut costs? It seems we're being very short-sighted. So the feeling I got from watching the Board of Finance comments from the Board of Finance was, hey, cut $100,000, even though that may mean that in the future, we're gonna end up spending a lot more money to fix the problem we're creating now. And so, I don't like to think of students as product, but we're essentially have a system to produce the best student outcomes for our students, which we call it product. And if we go through the process of trying to cut costs without recognizing the quality of the product that we're producing going down, we're doing ourselves a disservice, because lots of companies fall into this trap where they worry about the next quarter, they worry about the next reporting period, and they start cutting costs. And in the long term, what happens is it becomes a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You cut costs, you have lower quality, people stop using the product or stop moving to this town because the schools aren't great. And then it becomes worse the following year because you have lower tax revenue, and then now you have to cut even more. And it's very short-sighted. So I think it's important to recognize that when we're talking about resources, it's not about looking at, hey, this is the school's budget, we have to move money from this group of students to this group of students, and they're fighting for it. That's a terrible way to look at what we're doing. It's the town's budget as a whole, and the schools are our biggest asset for the town. It is the largest driver for people moving here and creating tax revenue. And we should look at it as a holistic town budget and where the money is actually going, whether it's going to activities for certain folks versus an asset that would really add value to everyone living in the town, as opposed to saying, hey, we're going to lock ourselves into this budget. I also want to mention that a 3.2% increase is below the current inflation. So even if we say, hey, it's an increase, it is still technically, mathematically, economically a cut. And so to take a presented budget that already represents a cut, I think it's very short-sighted to then demand a further, almost seemingly arbitrary cut to it.
Thank you. Laura or Steph?
None from me.
Thank you, Steph.
Nothing from me, but I agree with Chirag wholeheartedly.
Same.
Both. That brings us to item 4 on the agenda, the 2022-2023 operating budget. And I think that the task before us has been framed pretty reasonably by the comments that have been made already, which is that at the Board of Finance meeting on Monday evening, there was no action taken on our budget, but there was a consensus and request that the board come back together here and see what could be done to reduce the budget by $100,000. And so the task before us tonight is to see whether we can identify $100,000, or specifically $96,619, to reduce the budget and determine whether we conclude that that is an impossible task, or whether we identify those reductions and adopt a revised number, or whether we identify those reductions and advise the Board of Finance about what we would do if they were to set the number at a $96,000 reduction. So with that as sort of the framework, I'll turn it over to Dr. McKinnon to kind of update the board on where he is with this.
Okay, thank you everyone and good evening. Chris, thank you for setting up the two options that you have. I think it's our job as the administration just to present you with what potential cuts could be so you can make a decision whether you're going with option 1 or option 2. So we discussed potential reduction areas, and you can see here that on this screen we listed 4 potential areas that have a savings. There are 2 additional areas that are potentially also a savings. However, we've highlighted those in red because we feel that they could be detrimental. So potential cut number 1, or in the category in level A, could be further building level reductions, miscellaneous cuts, approximately $10,000. So it just means that we would go back and look at Reading Elementary School and John Green Middle School and ask the administration of the school to find $10,000 in the operations side that they have control over. So things like instructional supplies, dues and fees, office supplies.
And that's 10,000 total, not $10,000 each building.
That's $10,000 total.
And that was on our menu when we met March 1st also.
That was,
And
that's
then
correct.
below the line, we didn't take that reduction.
That's correct. That was in, I think we provided that as an option during workshop 3 or 4.
The last one.
Right, workshop 4. Item number B would be a cost saving to the technology cost center, and that would be the elimination or the combining of a network administrator position for a savings of $55,000. We can talk about that in a subsequent slide. We have an organization chart that will help you understand what a network administrator does and what the infrastructure that we have in terms of positions in the district. So we can talk about that in a moment. Option C could be delaying some hardware replacements in the form of interactive whiteboard for approximately $13,000.
And $13,000 that pays for 4 of them. Okay, if I recall, they're about $3,000 each.
They are about that, about 2,600.
Option D is a reduction to the Reading Elementary School cost center. We have a teacher that's going on a 1-year leave of absence, which is allowed by contract. So the person is coming, not here next year, then coming back the following year. So we would hire someone for a 1-year appointment to substitute for that particular teacher. And we anticipate that would be a $20,000 savings because the person that we would hire for 1 year is less than the person that's leaving salary-wise, in approximately $20,000. And then the 2 areas we don't recommend, but they're on the board, would be item number E, facilities projects out of the cost center facilities, and that is a roof restoration to John Reed Middle School in the amount of $8,200, and that's in the facilities special project line. We had a facilities committee walkthrough this week where we actually went up on the roof of the school, and there are several leaks in John Reed Middle School at the moment. We think it's related to the penetrations in the roof relating to the HVAC infrastructure, and the $8,200 we feel could be a short-term measure to repair those leaks. And then we would discuss as a facilities committee what a more long-term approach could be. But investing $8,200 could actually delay a more significant roof replacement in the future.
And the restoration really is plugging holes. Restoration is sort of a weird way to describe it, but it's plugging holes and preventing further penetration around the equipment that's up there.
Correct.
Can I ask a question? Are the holes currently causing more damage? Like there's water leaking?
Water's coming
across
in
the
and
wall?
out all over the place.
So, anytime water comes into a building, I don't think that's a good thing.
No.
But
I'm not trying to
of-
say defend it. I'm just.
Yeah, no.
I'm trying to put a point out.
But in terms of damage, the damage right now, we're replacing ceiling tiles where water's dripping. There was a place where water dripped into an electrical outlet, which we had to replace. So yeah, they're needed repairs, but not significant damage, but just an ongoing problem that we need to address.
And this has been put on the cut list in March before we had the facilities walk, and I think everybody who was involved in that walk agrees that it would be foolish not to do this work.
Not to mention embarrassing to have a school where there's buckets down and catch falling
Yeah.
out.
And then item F is a reduction to Reading Elementary School Cost Center, reducing RES from 25 sections to 24 sections, which is a reduction of a teacher. The savings would be approximately $67,000, and we have subsequent class size data, but we are not recommending that as an option. It's just something that we had in our previous cut list at our last workshop.
So your subtotal there is the lines in white, but not the lines in red.
Correct. Yeah. So that brings us to items A, B, C, and D in the amount of $98,462, excluding items E and F.
Item A, is that like usually what leads to teachers having to buy school supplies? That $10,000? I don't know what it's tied to.
No, not typically. So, a $5,000 cut across the board could mean that the teachers are not replenishing classroom libraries at the same rate of speed. The number of new library books might be reduced. It would never be for a critical supply. It would be something that's more anticipated and desired, but not necessarily something that's critical to
It
them.
could be
Like a
something,
magazine subscription or something.
it could be copy paper, Post-it notes, folders, pencils. We really are getting, because we've
But
got
that's what I'm saying,
obviously,
is when you talk about things like that, then to me, it's like, well, they need those things, so they're gonna have to go into their pockets to buy it, right?
I think that the practical impact is, there are frequently years where we get into January, February, March, April, and the decision is made to sort of freeze spending in those lines because we need to make sure that we're going to land the plane.
Right.
And the leaner you make that line, the earlier you sort of bring that freeze conversation into effect, particularly depending on what things like health codes do.
and Scott just mentioned it may not just be in 611, it could be in cleaning supplies, cleaning products for the building, it could be paper towels, it could be cleaning supplies for floors. But, we've already gone to this area. It's
It's
just,
going to be building
it's
substitutes theoretically, it's,
okay, right.
I'm trying to understand the what we gain versus what the impact is to people, the students and the teachers and faculty and staff, right? Cleaning supplies is, I think, unacceptable to not have enough cleaning supplies at this point, right?
It would probably be more increasing the level of risk, that if we needed a great deal of cleaning supplies, as we did, for instance, last year, that we could run out, and then we would probably need to do a transfer if there was a line that was running higher than anticipated. I don't want people to think that this means that teachers would be required to purchase pencils for their students. That's really not.
Or the classrooms would be clean. It just means that
Just for my input, I think that I would not support cutting something like this. I mean, I think it's important that we, leave a small amount of flexibility in there for these various supplies. And this just feels like, my perspective is the exercise that we're doing here is a little bit insulting because we've already spent hours and hours going through the budget, cutting the fat everywhere that we can cut. And now we're sort of having to pull it from areas that we've already decided as a group are not wise to pull it from. So unless something really makes sense to me right now, I'm not going to, I don't think it's wise to support cutting it. So this isn't something that I would support.
Why don't we move on from sort of the unspecified $10,000 onto the sort of more substantive pieces and talk maybe about the technology conversation.
absolutely. Okay, so if you can all see that slide, option A is currently the organization chart for technology. We currently have a director of technology and digital learning, Sarah Scafani, who is here tonight. And underneath Sarah, there's a network administrator in Easton and a network administrator in Reading. And under each network administrator, there are 2 technology paraprofessionals. So the option here, which is option B, is to reduce one of the layers underneath the Director of Technology and Digital Learning. We have a retirement next year for the network administrator in Easton. And what we're looking at doing here is combining, instead of having a network administrator for Easton and a network administrator for Reading, is to really combining that into one network administrator that oversees both towns under the over the 4 technology paras that are still there. So that the savings would be about a $55,000 savings to Reading, and it would also be a small savings to Easton because we're essentially collapsing 2 positions into one.
Quick question on, so this position is a non-bargaining unit position. It's a non-certified position. Is it a 403B pension position? I'm wondering whether there's additional employee benefit cost here that we split, because I know that our pension has a match of something like 8% of salary. And so if this individual or a subsequent individual that's an incumbent in this position comes at a cost of 110 plus 8 in pension, and there's going to be a MERS piece too, I would think. Is the 55 the full savings, or might it be a little bit more?
There could be a savings to MERS. I don't think there's a savings to health insurance.
I'm not even thinking about health insurance.
Okay.
I'm thinking about health insurance in the aggregate. I'm
Yeah,
thinking
yeah.
about the MERS and the pension match.
Yes.
And, you know, I know it's sort of putting people on the spot. I don't know if it's possible to sort of ping Vicky or figure out what's going on in the system that you have access to understand whether that's a legitimate thing or not. Because we're here talking about hundreds of percentages of budgets. So if we're talking about 55,000, we might as well know whether it's 55,000 or 62,000.
Okay, great. We can check on that.
Yeah.
And let you know. I think it's possible.
I
So
have a question. When
Yes.
is the retirement? Is that happening at the end of the 21-22 school year?
Yes, end of this school year.
Okay.
This is the definition of the network administrator. Someone to ensure the stable operation of computer networks includes the overall digital security, planning, developing, installing, configuring, maintaining, supporting, and optimizing all network hardware, software, and communication links. We feel that one network administrator in its current role could meet these responsibilities. And we'll just,
I think that sounds, I think that sounds like a positive solution.
Okay.
Sarah, I was gonna ask, if we don't do some of the other hardware upgrades, I'm imagining that may lead to a bit more work for this person. Just because, you know, there's gonna be older equipment. Is
Yes.
that a concern? So if we do this, should we then not make sure that we don't cut the other things?
It is harder to support older construction.
Security wise, there's no concern over the limited abilities of one person managing the job as far as, because security, I'm imagining there's lots of legal limitations and second, third, stuff like there's second, third order consequences. So that if we're saving money here, are we then setting ourselves up to have lots more expense for like a breach?
We are, I don't believe that we are, no, we have a really good system in place for our digital security throughout all of the airline. So I'm really comfortable with how we have all of that structured.
The systems for Easton and Reading are similar enough
Yeah.
that the overlap is
Yes.
skill set wise is not an issue.
In fact, they actually did overlap those so that there is redundancy in both, which is really the way to go. So with all of the cybersecurity, I'm very comfortable with that. the way that it's-
Are you comfortable with the overall workload?
Most of our systems have been moved to the cloud, and so as that migration continues to happen, it becomes much more manageable. You know, 10 years ago, you had a server room and you had equipment and you needed to be there for that equipment. And now that can be monitored and managed in a much more robust way through cloud computing. So I think that that gives us the security that we need and the support that we need without needing to worry that we are hurting our infrastructure or what's provided to our students.
Did you catch Laura's question about workload?
I think it's manageable. I think this is a great way of being able to really create some parity and really create more of an infrastructure that works together. You know, I think in the system that we have currently, we have Easton and Reading. And I think the idea of really making those be Easton and Reading together rather than separate is really where we want to go for the future. And I think
There's a
we'll get-
separate network administrator of Region 9 is on.
And right now, there is a separate network commissioner in Region 9, that's all, yes. And I think those efficiencies and really the ability to look at the whole system becomes really important. You know, like a great example is Google. You know, our Google is not Easton Google and Reading Google, it is ER9. And so that's just one example of where it just makes sense to have one person really facilitating all of that work.
Okay. And this is an opportunity that was born out of a recently announced retirement, not
Yes.
letting anybody off in unemployment resource.
If you were gonna design a team, the new structures have to do it, right?
Okay. This is an option that we're not recommending. So I don't think we need to spend too much time on this. But the idea would be, we currently have 25 sections of class sizes, 25 sections at Reading Elementary School. If we did reduce from 25 sections to 24 sections, we would possibly look at first grade. Right now, if we have 5 sections, which is what we plan to have, then there would be 16 students in a classroom. If there were 4 sections, there would be 20 students in a classroom. So the column over on this side under class size, all the way to the right, would be what would the class size be if we reduced any one of those grade levels. And you can see 22 in kindergarten is too high, 27 in grade 4 is too high, 21 in grade 5 seems more reasonable, but one of the grade 3. But we've talked a little bit about the current cohort in grade 2. They have significant needs. Students require a lot more intervention. So we do see the value in keeping grade 3 class sizes low. And 3 sections of 4th grade, 25 students in class is just not a sustainable model. So the only real window there could be grade 1, but we're not comfortable with that right now.
Stephanie, you'll recall the year that we went down to 3 sections of it was either 4th grade or 3rd grade, and that brought class size up to 23 in the elementary school.
Yes.
And I recall repeated conversations with Natalie Hemmons the year after the budget cycle about the adverse impacts of that generally, so.
It was a very challenging year. And so I think we're also very sensitive to the fact that we're not in a typical year this year. And so that increases our level of concern about deviating from what we have proposed in the number of sections, in that in a sort of more normal year, 20 students in 1st grade is at the high end, but it's certainly something that's doable. Our kindergartners in some cases have not had any preschool experience. They've been at home for the last 2 years. And so they are really experiencing school for the first time this year. And as we know, those first years build a critical numeracy and literacy foundation. And so I would be concerned about not being able to provide the level of individualized attention to those students that.
Do you have any sense as to what the potential is for folks to be enrolling for the first time in 1st grade next year, who have maybe been in private kindergartens and daycares for an extra year because of the circumstances of reopening?
I do not, but 1st grade, I don't know for a fact this year, but 1st grade is always a little bit of an unknown because we know kindergarten is not compulsory. So there are parents who keep their children out for kindergarten or do private K, and then
they arrive for first grade.
So we're relying on a current cohort of 76 becoming 78, which would give rise to a 1920 class size if you were to drop there, with no flexibility for additional enrollment, basically.
Right.
Right, and I think to your point, the number could be soft, could be more. Right.
Even 4 kids at that point pushes you into 21s and 22s.
And enrollment, we're not just talking about enrollment next year, we're talking about enrollment the following year, enrollment's also ticking up, so.
Right, we'll be back here talking about adding a $70,000 teacher a year from now, almost without a doubt, based on the projections.
Right. Okay, so now you have kind of getting back to where we left off. These were the different options. Level A, building level reduction. Item B, the combining of the administrator network position. Item C, delaying hardware replacements. Item D, the lower fund replacing the replacement for the teacher, which is $98,000.
Can you explain the difference in, for line D, the difference in a teacher level? Are there different qualifications or levels of experience?
When we budget for a new position, Laura, we typically budget at a level that is master's degree step, anywhere from step 1 to 5. So teachers have pretty much identical certifications in elementary school, unless you're a specialist in mathematics or reading or special education. So if you are a 3rd grade teacher, your certification is pretty common. However, teachers have different degrees. Some teachers may have a bachelor's degree, some teachers may have a master's degree in education. And then depending on your levels of experience and how many years you've been teaching, there's differences in salary. So we have a teacher who has a master's degree and a certain level of experience who is going on a leave of absence. That person's salary is pretty, I would say, above average. And we're budgeting for a teacher coming in at a lower level. And that's pretty typical. We actually refer to that as breakage. When we talk about when a teacher's going to retire, we anticipate hiring a teacher with less experience, and that's savings.
Were you gonna replace that teacher with this level of person regardless of this request to reduce the budget?
Yes.
Okay. So this was gonna happen and like you were gonna,
This is
the hiring process like this.
This is due to happen since we approved the budget and now.
Yeah, so this is a leave that's just happened. It's just an opportunity
So-
to think about it.
It's not something we're doing to try to save money. This is the process. We just happen to be saving money.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. What can you share what grade the teacher is?
Yes, grade 4.
Okay. And what's the class size in grade 4?
Attendance can move year to year, so there's no guarantee that the teacher being backfilled would be a 4th grade teacher.
That's correct.
Laura, what he's saying is that they would have backfilled this teacher the exact same way regardless of this request.
But what Laura's saying is,
Oh, I didn't. Yeah.
what is the impact of class size if you're bringing in somebody clean to the team? And we're talking about where to reduce staff.
Oh, I thought we weren't talking like that, the reducing the staff was off the table.
No, I was just curious if it was in a grade level where we had lower or higher class sizes, but I didn't hear the part that we were that this would have happened either way. So that's good.
Okay. So you have those options. And we have the sandbox. Well, I don't even know whether we need to, I don't know whether we need to go to the
No,
sandbox.
I know the only ones that you guys, the staff and Laura can chime, the only ones I'm really comfortable with are the director of the network administrator and the teacher. I mean, the teacher thing was gonna happen anyway, but the network administrator just seems like a good idea.
So B and D, summing to 75,462.
Yeah, and I can't accept reducing a teacher or letting, I think it's a disgrace that we have buckets sitting around this building catching with how much we all pay in taxes.
Mhm. And I agree with that. And I just want to be clear too, that these are personnel changes and new information has come up since our last meeting. And this was not an exercise to simply take cost out of the budget because of, well, I just want to be clear that, you know, that these are new information that are coming to us, and it's not a lack of diligence that happened leading up to our original budget.
Yeah, no, maybe we should make that point. Yeah, thank you, Laura.
Well, I think that's a fair point. And I would say that we plan and we start developing the budget in January, and we move through February, March. And then even after this, we move through the budget process in April, May, June, and over the summer. There are going to be adds and takeaways. So a teacher could retire, which could mean a savings, but it might mean that someone at a lower level moves and we hire someone at a lower level, and it could be something that we might need to fund, and it's something we didn't anticipate. So this is, budgeting really is forecasting with the data that we have at the time. We could have a special education student leave the district. We could have a special education student enter the district, and we're responsible to pay and meet that student's needs. We could have a teacher retire. We could have a boiler that needs to be replaced, and so on. So things will change. This thing will most certainly change.
It's a best estimate of future expenses, and you have to sort of pick a point in time where you stop and you say, this is our best estimate right now. And on March 1st, we stopped and we said our best estimate is this. And now, with circumstances having changed, the administration has identified a couple areas where, since March 1st, there are opportunities to the tune of $75,000.
Yeah, no, I think it's important for the community to understand that we're not going out of our way to cut things. We just got lucky.
And we could have equally gotten unlucky. I feel like there have been years where, in that intervening period, there's been bad news delivered, and we've had to go the other way.
Quick question on process wise. I was fairly upset about the board finance thing. So I came in thinking that we could essentially tell them, no, we're not changing. But they can just supersede us and come back and say, this is your budget. Do whatever you want.
Right, so one option is to say 23,896,6119 is it. We adopted it on March 1st, and thank you for suggesting we go look. We looked, and there's nothing to be found. Another option is to say, you've asked us to tell you what 23.8 would look like. Here's what 23.8 would look like. A third option is just to say we've adopted 23.8, and I guess a fourth option is to say we've done none of those things, but we found $75,000 in savings, and we're comfortable adopting a number that is 23,821 or whatever it is. Possibly also saying, if you really want to survey another $25,000, here's what it looks like.
But they can come back. Like, we could say, no, we're not cutting anything. It's 23,896. But they can come back and say, too bad, you're getting this.
We could cut 75 right now, and then on Monday, they can say, that's great, we're gonna cut another 100.
Okay.
And then we're back here on Tuesday saying, where are we gonna get the 100 after we just got the 75?
And
That's
if we can't force it to go to the town to decide, they're the only ones that can.
right. So.
Do
That's
we
fine.
feel comfortable cutting the 75,000 now, understanding that we just had two, unexpected positive things happen for the budget, and we could move forward and have two negative things happen, or we could have 4 more students in the second grade next year and need to be, having a special meeting to add a $80,000 teacher. I mean, does it seem safer for us to keep the budget as is and have a little bit of
Like a buffer?
flexibility for those unexpected increases to come in?
As a practical matter, if we walk through this meeting and say we found $75,000 in now money that is not earmarked towards anything, then it's overwhelmingly likely and reasonable for the Board of Finance to say you don't need that $75,000. It's not even earmarked. Right? So it's a natural place to reduce the budget.
So there's no normal buffer built into the budget for those things that can occur.
I feel like if you go back 8 or 10 years, there were specialized contingency lines, but those don't exist.
But if it happened and occurred, we just figure it out that it's a better solution.
If between now and a year from now, if there's an additional $100,000 or $200,000 of costs that come up, the first step would be how do we adjust the existing budget to make it work? And if it's so, and that would be not buying supplies, it'd be cutting programs, doing whatever you need to do to make it work. Or on the backside, going back to the town and saying, here's the unanticipated circumstances, here's the amount that we need, and here's why.
Okay.
For context, the last time that's happened locally, I believe, if you go back 5 and 6 years, Easton went back to their town 2 years in a row for additional appropriations, because their health insurance was above budget.
So adding in, so we're in the sandbox at the moment, and adding in 55,000 for the network admin and $20,462 for the savings of the 1-year replacement would bring the budget down to 3.30. And that's a reduction of $75,462.
And there may be some additional savings on the
On CT
By
minutes,
benefits, right?
Reverse,
on
right.
the, so.
I'm comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable with much else.
Steph, when you say you're comfortable, are you comfortable formally revising the budget down to 3.3?
I'm comfortable with the 20,000 and the 55,000. But I'm not comfortable taking other money that we might need.
The question was more comfort level with formally revising the budget down versus identifying them as areas for which we would go, but not making any formal move right now.
Right. Yeah, then yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my preference would be to avoid a formal motion and approval of the new budget and simply identify the savings and propose a contingency line.
Right.
I think we
Why?
calculate,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think you calculate CT MERS as 8% of gross, is it 8% of gross salary? So that would be about $9,000 split between Easton and Reading, so potentially 4,500 a ballpark, something like that.
Sound wrong. CT MERS is 16.75%, then 18.2%.
That's what the increase is, but I'm wondering.
It's going from 16.7 to 18.2, but is that split between the employee and the employer half and half? So are we looking at 9 and
Do you recall, Scott, if you calculate if it's about 8%, for CT MERS, it's about 8% of someone's gross salary?
Yeah, I don't know about the for the pension benefit.
Hold on, let me see if I can find
I'm
it.
not, the estimate with 80 grand, 79, 60, 100, so. And that's damn close to what they asked, right?
I think that's, so if I went back to the sandbox,
Yeah.
uh,
I can imagine that's good enough to get their approval. So that, Laura, I was gonna ask why not just do the formal thing and say, hey, look, we got close to what you wanted. That way, at least we know they'll likely to approve it.
okay, if I added in 4,500 as a conservative estimate, it would be a total of $79,962 and would bring us down to 3.28%.
Sure, Og, to answer your question, because I think it would be nice to have a little bit of contingency.
No, we were just talking about that and don't, generally, they don't build contingencies into the budget, they just request them when we need them. Because I think if we go back with saying, hey, we found 60.
No, I understand. I understand. I just think as a matter of principle, we understand that the budget can make small fluctuations over time. And we came up with a number of 23,896 at the beginning of March. And I think we all felt we felt that was a strong budget, and I stand by that.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, but we didn't
No,
have.
I understand they would be likely to say no.
But we didn't have contingency built into the budget when we, in March, when we first finalized it, right? We just happened to edge out 80 grand now because 2 people leaving. So it's, if we didn't have contingency then and we were comfortable with not having contingency then, I don't know what we gain. I understand, like, anytime I do any project, I'd like to have a little buffer, but I don't know what we gain other than throwing it back to us again. You know,
I guess, I mean, for me personally, the main reason is because we're really close to that 22 number in the grade 2. And last year's grade 2 is struggling right now. And we've got to lower the class size for grade 3 next year. And we talked a little bit, I think, a couple of months ago about not wanting to repeat that problem going forward. Plus, so what happens if that's not 106, it's 108 when we get to August, or it's 110. I think we're right on the cusp there. So that's where I'm coming from. I mean, I'm gonna go with the group on this one, but that's just my perspective.
You're concerned that you'd want the 70,000 to hire another teacher in second grade if enrollment goes up any further over there.
If enrollment goes up any further, yeah, not currently, but if we are in a situation come August where, that class size is a little bit bigger than we expected and we need to make a move.
And that's based on a projected increase of 8 students in that cohort already.
Bring up that slide real quick, just, I don't know,
Which slide?
the one with this class.
Oh, sorry, I'm gonna cast those up.
So, what would happen if we did get an extra more enrollment than we anticipated? And the class sizes were gonna be bigger, would we then just go back and ask for another teacher?
This does happen.
Where?
Happened 2 years ago.
Yeah, and I don't think you ask for more money, I think we find for money. And it's a strain. I would imagine I was here 2 years ago.
Yeah. We did it in August, July,
Very
August.
late.
Yeah.
Really a couple weeks before.
It happens.
And it was a fire drill, but
So you don't ask for more money, you just cut it.
Yeah.
All right, now I'm more.
Is that what we did? What? Somewhere else?
I don't remember
I don't recall going back
details.
to the town.
We definitely did go back to
No.
town.
Okay, we
I
must-
feel like Scott Rice at the time thought he could find something somewhere to make it work.
Okay.
He didn't like it.
But that's
It
what
was-
happens.
it was just-
That's,
Which column's wrong, right?
Possible sections.
Why is it wrong? If you reduce from any line, that was what it would be. You go from 5 to 4, or 5 to 4, or 5 to 4, or 5.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's when I was in school, 12 and 8, and it was 20, so that's why I was adding them all up.
Sorry, 12.
Because preschool wasn't carried over.
That's showing if you reduced across the board.
Oh, yeah, we're not doing it every
That's
class.
showing if you reduce them all, but it says 24.
No.
You would have to pick one of those to get to 24.
oh, right.
But you reduce them in all at once.
To show you what the impact of any one would be.
Yeah, that's kind of misleading. You would take that out.
There you go.
That's what
And third grade should be.
Dr. McCann, normally in school, or in your previous experience, do you normally worry about that and build it into the budget as a little bit of a buffer, or do you just roll the dice into that?
You don't build buffers into education budgets. That is, it's just, you try to present the most honest budget you can at the time with the data that you have. And sometimes there are changes for the good, and sometimes there are changes for the negative. Like, for example, an unexpected 15 students moving into a particular grade level and you have to hire a new teacher. I've never, in my experience, gone back to the town and said, we need to hire a teacher for $70,000. At that point, you just got to make some hard decisions.
You hope you get a set off somewhere else.
Right, and it's kind of like we didn't budget 38,000, maybe a little bit more for landscape this year, right? We had to find the money. So.
I also think it's worth mentioning that, this is 2 years out of a pandemic, and these are somewhat extenuating circumstances. And I think that we should do everything that we can to make sure that, we don't have to make any further cuts next year.
In theory, Stephanie, as the expert in this, if it came to pass that we needed to hire a new teacher and we had trouble pulling from anywhere, we could reallocate some of the RBESR money from interns and paras to a certified teacher, I would think.
It would
In
still
theory.
be
It
within
would
the
still be
salary
qualified.
line. Yeah, it's not out of the question. It would really have to do with timing.
Right.
Right.
It's not a preferred approach, but it's,
And we would want to make that decision early in the summer, right? Because we hire for the academic year during the summer.
and we have been deliberate about not using that grant money for things that we created this will put like teacher.
What's the reluctance to go back to the town? Just out of curiosity.
It's mostly political in the context of the fact that you go to the town with what you think you need, and the town allocates a certain amount for a referendum, and you don't want to get into the habit of trying to go back before the finance board and then a special town meeting for the purpose of talking about these things, and
But if you're not, so part of it is just the unpredictability, right? You're saying, hey, I'm willing to take that risk. But if you're not building in the contingency and then you're not willing to go back to park, you're gonna end up more often than not.
you're always on the wrong side of it.
Yeah,
I think there's a certain acceptable level of risk. And you would find yourself going back to the town for a significant issue. Like a boiler problem or something, a $200,000 issue. It's probably where you would.
so single.
I keep bringing up the boiler.
Just picking at the scabs.
Maybe with your experience with the politics of this all, I don't dislike Laura's idea about keeping a contingency. I worry about the way the Board of Finance will see them just kick it backwards and say no.
So I think if you were going to build in a contingency, you would do it through conversations in January and February and build your budget and your overall presentation and say, here's what we're asking for. In part, we have built in this contingency for the concern about A, B, and C. And it's more awkward to do that now and say, not only we're standing by our number, but we've turned part of it into a contingency. Just seems like a complete change of course. Now, there's something called a non-lapsing account, which allows Boyd's Education to carry over up to 2% of the operating budget that's unspent year over year. And then that can be built up as more or less a contingency fund. But that requires the Board of Finance to sign off on the creation of such an account. And to date, our Board of Finance has been reluctant to agree to do that. So a way to get to a contingency model is to create a non-lapsing account that has some guardrails around it as to when you can go to it, and that avoids ever going back to town because you've created rules around it.
Seems like that's smart.
And it also incentivizes districts not to spend every penny in the district. They're budgeted.
So Laura, what do you think about that?
About the, what Chris just suggested, creating a contingency fund?
What do you think, well, the concern about having a contingency or buffer and going back to the Board of Finance with it?
I mean, I understand all of the reasons why to not do a contingency plan, and I think many of the reasons are political. But I mean, had we been having this conversation 2 weeks ago, we wouldn't have these two, the $75,000, right? We would look at our budget, we would say, we don't feel comfortable cutting anything. And so, I feel like we're, it's a timing thing here, and, who knows what's going to happen in 2 weeks from now. I think that we spent the first 2.5 months of the year doing a lot of diligence, having a lot of conversations, talking through all of these things. And we came up with a number that I know I felt, good about, and I felt like we had, done the work to get there. I don't know. I mean, I still want to, I'm still inclined to stand by it, because that first or second grade class next year, it really worries me.
If we had done the final vote today, we probably would not include this 80 grand, right? We would have said, okay, we were able to save this money, therefore we're presenting a budget. So we got the data, right? And so, yes, I think, we spent a lot of work to get to on March 1st, but now we have more data and we have another shot at refining that number. Just like if we had bad news, I would have refined the number up if we had to.
No, I understand. I mean, if you guys will recall a couple of months ago, I mean, I wanted to add a teacher this year to reduce the second grade class. And so that's really where I'm coming from. I mean, yeah, that's just where I'm coming from.
I mean, to Sharag's point, had we known about this on February 28th, on March 1st, we probably would have been adopting a budget of 3.3% and said, great, this helps us not have to go to teacher or anywhere else at this point, all the same. Because we drew a line in that sand and we haven't crossed it with these either. These are completely new.
But I think Laura's saying is she's already worried about.
Oh, I agree with that.
So.
Yeah, I mean, even when we approved this budget on March 1st or whenever, I mean, at that point, I still wanted to add a teacher, but we just didn't get there, and I'm fine with it where it's at. It's just my preference. I mean, if the board feels comfortable adopting a new budget, I'm not going to stand in the way of that.
But I'm also comforted by the fact that if there are more students and we do need an additional teacher, we're gonna hire one, right? And maybe cutting something else, but the kids aren't gonna, be in a larger class to their detriment because of it.
What would we cut though? I mean, we've cut everything.
Right.
All right.
Right, but I think that one thing to pull out of that dialogue is that the reluctance to go to that drop to 24 sections is sufficiently strong that there's an inclination to say that 25 is already pushing it, and so 24 is a bridge too far.
Right.
And it's a great argument in the sense that we're not going to 24 because there's a greater risk that we'll need 26 than we're comfortable with 24.
Correct.
So, okay. So the question then for the board is whether we are identifying $79,000 as what we would propose to reduce, or we're straight revising down the budget to that number. I don't see what the grand total would be with that. Again, it's the last one,
79,000.
and it's left the total of the budget, which would bring the budget down to. So.
Oh, there we go.
There you go. 23,821, 157.64, down from 23,896, 619, 64. That makes sense?
Yep. What's the downside of formalizing it and going back to kind of saying this instead? Or what's the upside of doing it the other way? I'm just trying to understand.
Well, I think and I could be wrong, but what I'm seeing is the only downside of not approving a new budget right now is that we might have to meet again next week and then formally adopt it. And I'm fine with meeting next week if it gives us a chance at having some flexibility in case we do need that extra class.
Our regular meeting is Tuesday anyway for April.
Oh, right. That's right. Yeah. We're already meeting anyway. So I mean, from my point of view, I don't see any negative of going to the Board of Finance and saying, we are concerned about having to add another class next year. We want to create a contingency fund in case that happens. If that doesn't happen, we can either create a rollover contingency fund, or I'm sure there are a number of other ways that we can, use the money.
Practical reasons, I may not be I'm traveling next week. I may not be able to make the meeting, and considering how close the vote was for this budget, I worry.
So for also sort of for practical purposes, the Board of Finance deadline to adopt the number for us is Monday. So they'll adopt something on Monday, and then if it's different than what we've adopted on Tuesday, we'll make whatever technical changes need to be made to identify where we've made those reductions. But if we make these reductions in a formal sense right now, then it gives the Board of Finance the opportunity to adopt this number straight away, and we have no work to do on Tuesday on that topic. Steph, do you have a view?
I'm fine with adopting it tonight.
It's instant.
I think that we've identified areas where it's clear that a month ago we would have taken them out. And I think that that makes it rational to take them out now. The backside concern is that just give rise to another further reduction, and we're back here having this conversation on Tuesday with respect to going deeper than that. I think that's always a risk, but I think that we've done the administration has done a good faith effort to display to us what the options are, what the impacts of those options are. And gives us the opportunity to adopt this number and say, it's not $96,000, but it's 79,920, within $16,000 of what that number is. And it does no harm from an educational perspective, what we already adopted. And if we were comfortable that the March 1st budget was going to meet the needs of our students, then we have to be similarly comfortable that this will meet the needs of our students, because we've been told that it won't have an impact.
Right.
And that is sort of sufficiently persuasive to me to say, here's what it is, we're going to revise it down to this number, bring that back to the Board of Finance Monday, and say, this is what we did to meet your request, to try to find $100,000. We found $80,000 in an effort to do that. Please consider that in light of the fact that coming out of the pandemic, this is what it is.
And then making sure to point from the fact that we got lucky and wasn't any more fact, it's not like we were lazy before.
Right, because the other consensus I'm hearing about this is, but for this, there's a strong likelihood the consensus of the board would be no.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that a fair representation, Seth and Laura?
Can you repeat it? I was having a little bit of, it was a little bit muffled. I'm sorry.
To confirm that it's a sort of a fair representation to say that if we didn't have these reductions identified, there's a reasonable chance that the board would have said, no, there's nothing else we're willing to take out.
Absolutely.
That's correct. Yeah.
Late breaking calculations.
Yeah, we can revise CT mass to approximately $10,000. Which is,
It's a 60%.
right,
Also,
so it'll be 85,460.
I mean, that's as close as it is.
And so is that all of the pros or is that half of it?
That's,
Because we only get half of it.
that's half of it. No, that's all, no, all of it is about approximately 20,000.
Right, because it's 18%, a little over.
So it was 40 before, and so we're saving 20, and we're getting half, so that's.
No, it was 20.
Oh,
The position will still exist, but we're only paying for half of it. So we get 10 goes to Easton.
Right.
Alright, so what's the total amount here?
That was 85,462.
I meant the budget number.
The number.
The number is, would be here.
23,
So 11 grand shy of what they asked for.
Yeah.
A little less than that, because it was 90. They wanted to get it down to, yeah, what it else.
Yeah, I thank you, we're in our favor.
So,
So I'd like to make a motion to adopt the school budget for $23,811,157.64.
and that's an increase of 750, 119.64, or 3.25%.
Correct.
There's a second to Sherrod's motion.
I'll second.
Any stuff?
Yep.
All right, any further discussion on the motion? Hearing none, we will call the question. Steph?
Yes.
Laura?
If I abstain, can the motion still pass? Since there are fewer or only 4 of us here?
It doesn't need to be a majority of the overall board. An abstention is an effective no because you did a majority of those voting, but it would, whether it affects it is dependent on how it would go up.
Okay, I'll vote yes.
Sherrod?
Yes.
I will vote yes, and the motion will carry 4-0, and Dr. McKinnon and I will relay to the Board of Finance our revised number as well as a summary of our conversations. All right.
Motion to adjourn.
If there be no further items on the agenda, we'll look for Sherrod's motion.
Give me a second.
Any objection? Laura, do you second the motion to adjourn?
Yes, sorry, I didn't hear. Second.
Second objection, we are adjourned at 8:06 p.m.
All right.
Good night, everybody.